Hello. So, good morning everyone. I, Dr. Nisha Thakur, Head of the Department of History, on behalf of the department, is very pleased to welcome you all for this one-day workshop on methods and methodology in historical studies in collaboration with Netaji Institute for Asian Studies, Kolkata. This workshop aims to provide participants, particularly research scholars and postgraduate students, with a foundational and practical understanding of research methods, methodologies across disciplines, with a special emphasis on humanities and social sciences. This session, all the sessions, will explore various research approaches, data collection techniques, theoretical frameworks, and ethical considerations integral to academic research. We are very thankful to Netaji Institute for Asian Studies for extending their unwavering support to organize this workshop. I now request our Honourable Vice-Chancellor, Sir, Professor Sauren Bandyopadhyay, to come up on the stage for delivering the inaugural lecture.
Yes, sir.
I don't take felicitation. Could I first say a very big thank you to the Head of the Department of History and the colleagues for organizing this workshop. I particularly thank Dr. Netaji Kumar for taking the initiative. The Netaji Institute for Asian Studies also lent a helping hand to organize this workshop. I should also put on record our sincere thanks and gratitude to Honourable Chancellor Prof. Samit Ray for providing us the necessary logistics. He was scheduled to inaugurate the workshop, but he is away in Delhi, so he sends his best wishes. The Vice-Chancellor of Bengal State University, Warashat, was also supposed to come for this session, but again he has been tied up with some official work, and so he regrets his inability, but he sends his best wishes. Now, I had initially declined to say anything, but it was largely because of the persistence of Netaji that I decided to say some words. But before that, I should put on record our sincere gratitude to the outstation speakers. Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, who needs no introduction, who had been a friend of mine for years. We were near contemporaries in Oxford, and I had the privilege of serving the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, now currently Pradhan Mantri Sangrahalaya, as a member of the executive committee when he was the director. I also thank Professor Sharbani Guptu of Netaji Institute Patient Studies. Unfortunately, she cannot come because of her illness, but she has agreed to be present online. We are also happy that we have been able to welcome amongst us Dr. Subrata Nandi of the West Bengal State University and Shubhajit Haldar, who have been with Adamas for some time, but is currently an associate professor at Panchkot Mahavidyalaya. I hope I have spelled it correctly. Now, I will be very brief because we are all looking forward to the keynotes address by Mahesh. And as I stand before you, I am reminded of what Edmund Burke remarked as early as the 18th century in his celebrated reflections on the French Revolution, on the revolution in France, and I quote, people will not look forward to posterity, who never look backwards to their ancestors. People will not look forward to posterity, who never look backwards to their ancestors. What Burke was underlining was the importance of learning, teaching and researching history. I believe this has become particularly crucial when, since the mid-20th century, we have experienced the most significant expansion in the scope of historical studies. It has been the expansion of interest from the individual to the mass. It has been a shift from the drama of public events, centering on individual achievements or failures, to the understanding of structural changes, which over the centuries have transformed the lives of ordinary men and women. One result of this shift was the development of social history as a distinct branch of teaching and research. And I would like to underline some of the important shifts that occurred in this field of history, the social history. Undoubtedly, certain contemporary historical developments contributed to the development of social history. For instance, by the end of the 19th century, both Western Europe and the United States of America were undergoing a major socio-economic transformation, and this transmutation could not be encapsulated by conventional Rankian historiography. And to fill this vacuum, new historical methodology was required, and social history to a large extent was the outcome of this need. Again, by the early 20th century, the Marxian paradigm of historical materialism, with its emphasis on the means of production and relations of production, made many to conceive historical developments in the context of the rise and fall of social orders. This to help, I believe, the growth of social history. Besides, the rise of organized labor movement and the emergence of socialist parties in Europe pushed the issues of economic and social reform to the center of political stage, and this also prepared the stage for further development of social history. Moreover, it is generally believed that the First World War and the recurrent slumps and depressions of the 1930s came as a blow to the ideal of nation state, whose rise had been the great theme of 19th century historiography. This again made a new generation of historians to look beyond the institution of state for explicating historical developments. One of the upshots, I believe, of this surge was the development of social history. Whatever might have contributed to the growth of social history, the historiography of social history underwent certain fundamental shifts at the global level, which I wish to share. At the global level, because most of the shifts in historiography have first occurred at the global level and then it came to the other parts of the world. In its initial stage, social history was primarily concerned with the history of such social problems like poverty, ignorance, magic, witchcraft, insanity and disease. One work that instantly comes to mind is a celebrated work on religion and decline of magic, studies in the popular beliefs in 16th and 17th century England by Keith Thomas. The emphasis in such discourses was still on the problem as it posed to the society as a whole, rather than on the experience of the rank and file affected by these issues. Shubhata Nandi, who is a speaker in one of the panels, is now himself working on the magic in India, and probably he will touch on this. Historians working within this paradigm also studied the reforming efforts of private philanthropy, as seen in charitable institutions like schools, orphanages and hospitals, or the intervention of the state in the social field. In this exercise, while the attainments of organized charity and government concern received due attention, the recipients of care and attention were only occasionally heard. E.B. Pinchbeck and Margaret Hewitt's two-volume study on children in English society is a classic example of this trend of historical writing. A shift came in writing social history when scholars started concentrating on the home, the work, the place and the community. As G.M. Trevelyan put it, I quote, social history might be defined negatively as the history of a people with the politics left out, unquote. Trevelyan's social history of England reads like a catch-call for the miscellaneous topics which did not fit in conventional history. Much of this kind of history had a melancholic tone. There is in this literature a lurking regret for the end of the pre-industrial order and a revulsion for the ugliness of modern urban living. The third important point came with Adult School, whose initiation can be traced to such scholars as Mark Bloch and Lucien Faber. This group raised such questions as, how in any given society in the past did people apprehend their daily experience? What were their attitudes to time and space, pain and death, family relationships and religious observance? How should we characterize their ambitions and anxieties? What were the common values? What was the dividing line between elite and popular culture? And in this fundamental work had been produced by Peter Buck. Now all these problems came to be subsumed in a new and flourishing branch of historical inquiry, usually referred to as the history of Minnesota. The writing of social history came with historians of labor adopting a social history framework. The origin of this trend can be traced back to 19th century Britain with the rise of a group of historians sympathetic to the labor movement. Thanks to scholars like G.D.H. Cole and C.D. Beatrice Webb, the historians of this school was to impart the British labor movement a collective historical identity. The material and social deprivation, the tradition of self-help, and the struggles for improved wages and conditions of employment, all these were issues of historical inquiry. But I would argue that the most fundamental and qualitatively different turning point in the realm of social history came when a new group of Marxist scholars became interested in social history. I mentioned in this connection historians like George Rude, E.P. Thompson and Eric Hobsbawm, a broad range of scholars around what came to be known as the history group, which developed in the 1970s around Ruskin College, Oxford. Within the paradigm of what came to be known as oppositional history, they now developed what came to be known as history from below, or people's history, which, by seeking to recreate the subjective experience, was, in the words of Raphael Samuel, I quote, bringing the boundaries of history closer to those of people's lives, unquote, a fundamental shift in historiography. Let me give you another quote from Raphael Samuel, who initiated the history workshop group, which would help us to grasp the main contour of social history. I quote, people's history always represents some sort of attempts to broaden the basis of history, to enlarge its subject matter, make use of new raw materials, and offer new maps of knowledge. Implicitly or explicitly, it is oppositional. People's history today is characteristically used to denote a history which is local in scale, taking as its subject the region, the township or the parish, in the case of the city, the morphology of the individual quarter or suburb, or even of the individual house and street, unquote. So you see a fundamental shift broadening the contours of history. In other words, social history in the hands of the Marxists essentially became a history of social structure, representing the sum total of social relationships between the many different groups in society, with the category of class as the nucleus of this relationship, of course, with its cross-cutting ties with age, gender, race and occupation. This idea has been aptly encapsulated in the following quote from a leading historian, Keith Rixton, and I quote, "Society is a process. It is never static. For the social historian, the most challenging of tasks is that of recapturing that process, while at the same time discerning long-term shifts in social organization, in social relations, and in the meanings and evaluations with which social relationships are infused." Unquote. Once this paradigmatic shift occurred, new frontiers were opened in the realm of social history. For instance, urbanization, which was once studied essentially as an economic process, now came to be seen as a process of social change, including the assimilation of immigrants, the emergence of new forms of social stratification, the hardening of distinction between the work and leisure, and so on. Again, political events came to be analyzed in terms of the relationship with changing social structure. For instance, the gentry controversy concerning the English Civil War, about which we read in both undergraduate and postgraduate classes, was largely related to this analytical framework. Or take the issue of the origins of the Industrial Revolution. They were once seen in economic and geographical terms, but now they were related to the social structure of 18th century England and such factors like the law of primogeniture or open society or open aristocracy. Again, E.P. Thompson, in his classic work, The Making of the English Working Class, related the growth of the working class awareness during the Industrial Revolution in England not only to the factory system, but in the widest possible context, including religion, leisure and popular culture. His famous theory of the tyranny of the clock had an adverse effect on the working class life, had a great influence in understanding the English working class lives. We all know about his theory of the tyranny of the clock, where he agreed that the standard of living of the working class has increased, but they were also subjected to a different form of tyranny, the tyranny of schedule, the tyranny of routine, and the tyranny of the clock. At the same time, scholars working within a new paradigm of social history made significant contributions to our understanding of the history of women, history of crime and criminality, identity politics, sports, protest politics, childhood and emotions. History of medicine emerged as a new genre, and we have a new scholarship in history of medicine, and much of it has now been also reflected in Indian scholarship, where it is now shown that the introduction of Western medicine actually acted as a force to strengthen colonialism, and how the introduction of Western medicine also stultified the indigenous knowledge system of medicine in India, and therefore now there is a move to unfold the Indian knowledge system. One also needs to highlight how new nuances are continually introduced in dissecting the history of a social category. For example, what started as a women's history has now broadened itself into gender history. While women's history focused on women, gender history expanded the scope to encompass both women and men, analyzing how gender shapes everyone's experiences, bringing in focus the interaction of femininity and masculinity. And as we all know, gender history has marked a fundamental shift from the mere addition of women within the framework of broader, wider history to the identification of gender as an element structuring and being structured by power relations. If at a global level, scholars like Judith Butler and Elizabeth A. Povenelli can be counted as the pioneers in gender history and queer theory, for South Asian history, the contributions of scholars like Uma Chakraborty, Tonika Sarkar, Kumkum Sangeri, Minalini Sinha, Gail Omved, Antonia Barton, to name a few, as very fundamental contributions in the field. The other literature, which has widened the scope of history, is the discourse on environmental history. One of the best exponents is certainly Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, and we eagerly await his address. But I should be failing in my duty if I do not mention the recent exploration of climate change history and the Anthropocene, offering a nuanced perspective on humanity's relationship with the Earth system. Surely, one of the best products of this trend is Dipesh Chakraborty's celebrated work, one planet, many worlds, the climate paradox. In fact, what resulted in the process of such shifts was socialist becoming, to borrow a remark from Eric Hobsbawm, I quote, the history of society relying on a whole range of non-conventional and non-archival sorts of materials. The history of society paradigm has also reflected even in the writings of what was once perceived as essentially political history. For example, take the history of nationalism, and I would like to take the case of the historiography of Indian nationalism in this context. I feel the socialist framework has enriched our understanding of both the background to the growth of Indian nationalism and also to analyze the character of the nationalist movement that developed in India. Thanks to this literature, we have now come to know how certain structural changes in Indian society, introduced by the British Raj, laid the backdrop of Indian nationalism. Historians addressing this problematic have shown that under colonialism, the Indian society transformed itself from a status-based to a contract-based society. That is, while the pre-colonial society was based on status, under colonialism, the social relationship came to be based on economic contract, like the contract between labor and capital, or the cash nexus between the peasant and jamindar, or between the moneylender and the debtor. It is believed that this structural transmutation was linked to the introduction of market economy and the rise of the new social classes like capitalists and proletariat, a whole range of intermediary merchants and the middle class. You have now the commercialization of agriculture and the deindustrialization of the Indian economy, which led to the transition from subsistence to commercial agriculture, and this again led to the emergence of new social groups in the countryside. But what is important, as we are told, is that these new social classes or groups were subjected to a single pan-Indian exploitative political economy, which imparted a pan-Indian social outlook to these classes. And since all these classes were subjected to a common imperial oppressive mechanism, they tended to develop a pan-Indian grievance against colonialism, although there were internal social contradictions between these groups. This process, it is argued, created the social background to the emergence of Indian nationalism. So gone are the days when we were in our school days were told that there suddenly came Alan Octavian Hume, who initiated the process, and there was the establishment of the Indian National Congress. So now a completely new social perspective has been imparted as a result of the new trends in the social history and how social history has changed our understanding of the history of Indian nationalism. So what resulted in colonialism was the evolution of a community of economic and political interests on an all-India scale, which led to what I call a conglomerated national identity or consciousness against colonialism, which led to nationalism. At the same time, social historians, especially with the Marxist bent, have also pointed to certain dialectical contradictions within the national movement that developed under the aegis of mainstream Congress nationalism. It has been argued that the nationalist politics that developed under mainstream Gandhian nationalism basically operated within the matrix of the class interests of the emerging national bourgeoisie and the big landlords. Many scholars have again sought to introduce social categories while analyzing specific periods of nationalist movement. For example, many think that while the moderates represented the interests of emerging Indian capitalism, petty bourgeois interests lay at the base of extremism. We of course then had the subaltern historiography, which has contributed enormously in unraveling the voice of the subalterns in historical processes. We may disagree with some of the major contentions of the subaltern school, like the assertion of the basic autonomy of the subaltern politics, but we need to give credit to the subaltern school for opening our eyes to issues which had never been deliberated before. In other words, historical methodology has evolved in various ways and will continue to evolve. A perceptive researcher needs to be aware of such shifts in historiography to enable her or him to chart a course which she or he thinks apt for a research. For this, workshop like this is certainly valuable. As E.P. Thompson reminded us, I quote, historical explanation discloses not how history must have eventuated, but why it eventuated in this way and not in other ways, unquote. For this, an ideal researcher in India is required to search for new sources, going beyond the conventional archival sources, borrow shifts from historiography at the international level, but also develop national perspectives to develop a historical research consciousness which fits in the needs of the time. As none other that Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore reminded us in his famous work on Bharatvarsha, and I quote and I end with that. Rabindranath লিখলেন, sorry, I have to quote this in Bengali, otherwise you lose the flavor. ভারতবর্ষ এবং স্বদেশ, রবীন্দ্রনাথ লিখলেন, ভারতবর্ষের রাষ্ট্রীয় দপ্তর হইতে তাহার রাজবংশমালা ও জয় পরাজয়ের কাগজপত্র না পাইলে যাহারা ভারতবর্ষের ইতিহাস সম্বন্ধে হতাশ্বাস হইয়া পড়েন এবং বলেন যেখানে পলিটিক্স নাই সেখানে আবার হিস্ট্রি কিসের, তাহারা ধানের ক্ষেতে বেগুন খুঁজিতে যান এবং না পাইলে মনের ক্ষোভে ধানকে শস্যের মতোই গণ্য করেন না. What a wonderful quote. He summarizes what historians in a very complicated way tries to put their own ideas. With these words, could I once again thank the History Department first for enabling me to be here and to organize this workshop, and also I thank my esteemed colleagues, particularly from Solax, for being with us today. I forgot to mention the name of Shantanu, who has been a very dear student of mine, and he is now the professor of history in Kolkata University, and is also an adjunct professor in the history department of Adamas University. He has also kindly taken time off to be with us today. Thank you, Shantanu, very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the enlightening lecture and inaugurate the session. I now request our guest of honor, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, sir, to come up on the stage, and also Honourable Vice-Chancellor, sir, to come up on the stage to felicitate our guest. So let me introduce you first. Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, sir, is a professor of environmental studies and history at the Ashoka University. He was educated at the Hindu College, University of Delhi, and then at Oxford, where he has been a Rhodes Scholar. Dr. Rangarajan has worked as assistant editor with the Telegraph, Kolkata, and has been a commentator on current affairs with the audio-visual media in both English and Hindi. He has previously taught at the University of Delhi, where I was a previous student, and at Kriya University. He has also been visiting faculty at Cornell University, at Jadavpur University, and in the National Center for Biological Sciences, Bangalore. He was director, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library from 2011 to 15, and has also served as Vice-Chancellor, Kriya University from 2021 to 2022. He was the chair of the Elephant Task Force of the Government of India in 2010 and the member of the Forest Advisory Committee of the Ministry of Environment, Government of India. I now welcome sir and request you to deliver the lecture. Thank you, sir.
I also request Professor Ghosh, our Associate Dean, comes to that. So kindly preside over this. Yeah.
I'm a sociologist, but let me give a quote from a famous world-known sociologist. He said, "Sociology without history and anthropology is not sociology at all." So when we read sociology, when we study society, we have to go back to history of society. So I think it will be a learning experience for me today to learn from experts like Rangarajan who has come here, And I think we will all be beneficial to learn from what he tells us how to do and how to study society. So I would welcome this renowned expert here in this Adamas University and request him to deliver his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's very embarrassing to hear Professor Sauren Bandyopadhyay and Honourable Dean call me some renowned expert. I'm not. We are effectively students of a very complex changing world. I'm very struck by what Professor said about how you can't have sociology without history. You of course can't have history without sociology. History began as a branch of literature in Department of Humanities. Earlier in Delhi University I was in Department of Social Sciences, don't ask why. But I think over the last 50 years, or 60 years, particularly since 1940s, there's been a very rich, productive dialogue, history and the social sciences. History has gained a lot of categories from social sciences. So social sciences have enriched their understanding of how to place an issue in perspective, how to understand how we got to where we are and why we are where we are and where we might be heading. That is the historian's specific, unique perspective. We like to think so. Whether we give it or not is a different matter. It's a tall order. How we got to where we are. Who is the we? Is it inevitable that we are at the juncture we are? Are there certain critical turning points in the past? And if there are turning points, when were they passed? I'm very struck by a famous essay in 1958 by Professor Lewis called The Two Cultures Revisited, because the way the environmental history part shapes up, and I'm speaking as a historian who works on the environment. I look at human histories. I don't work on the hard history of the environment. So if you ask me, what is the atmospheric composition outside today, I won't know. But this was a very famous essay, which I'm sure if you're familiar with, The Two Cultures Revisited, where Professor Lewis said that there are two cultures, the literary culture and the scientific culture. When they view each other, it's a culture of incomprehension. They can't make sense of each other. They don't share the language. They don't share the method. They don't share the same logic. They don't even share the same sensibility. हिंदी में कहें तो एक को लगता है दूसरा अजीब है. Each looks the other is very strange. And this is something which I think you tackle when you look at environmental history. You tackle it at every stage. Partly because everyone around you wants to know the obvious answer. What should we do? What should be done? Can anything be done? If so, what? If something is to be done, by whom and when? This is easy if you're on the elephant task force. The task force consisted of scholars of elephants. Elephant behavior, elephant ecology. There's a couple of very accomplished forest officials. There were some NGO people. Between them we had in the room people who knew elephants from across India. Some knew the rest of the world also. And we were able to put together something in 4 months. It's a working report. It's not a scholarly study. But that is not the job of the historian. So you will wonder, why was I put in charge of it? Well, the answer is I was more ignorant of the subject than any of them. They may not agree on things. I'm supposed to be there to help them sort it out. But as a student of history, you are very struck by the fact that the 20th century was marked by very large clashes. Professor Sauren Bandyopadhyay touched on some of them. From 1917 to 91, there was the reality of the great clash between the Bolshevik Revolution and the market economies. Since 91, the one-party status survived. It has, and it's very important. It had come to democracy, particularly in China, Vietnam, Cuba. But it has integrated various levels of market economy. Vietnam and China a lot, Cuba less. At the same time, the 20th century saw nationalism come into its own. We are living through a period of major remaking of the nation in Europe and North America. But in the 20th century, we should not forget, FDR redefined the meaning of what it meant to be American. Similarly, there was a redefinition of what it meant to be Chinese, what it meant to be Indian. And this, of course, brings us to the other great change. One was the clash of two great systems. The other was the wave of decolonization, which ran its course through the 20th century. It's not over yet, but mostly it has completed itself. Along with this, there were these voices from below, the voices of the subordinate, which Professor Das referred to. One can pick one's favorite, Sheila Rao Gautam on women, E.P. Thompson on working class, Hobsbawm on bandits. You can see I am mostly choosing English authors. You can change that. But what happens if you define equality? And I think in the late 60s this comes up in a very major way. Suppose you define a notion of equality beyond humanity. What then? Or rather, what now? Because one of the philosophical problems which the environmental crisis brings to fore, when you look at, very boring subject, it looks boring, it's not. Sustainable Development Goals of UN, there are some 21 goals. I challenge you after reading them to recite any 5, it's very difficult. But one of the things common to these goals is a concern for other landscapes, other waterscapes, other atmospheres, other species, other ecosystems. So at some level a notion of equality, I'm not meaning it mechanically, that gorilla in Congo is equal to anyone in this room. I don't mean it in that sense. But a sense that we have to think of intergenerational equality, interspecies equality, and equality across ecological systems. I emphasize the last because for much of the 20th century and earlier, development largely consisted of destroying and replacing what was seen as natural made ecosystems. We can debate how natural they were. As a historian, I'll always complicate the question. One of the big debates today going on is, should nature be preserved by letting it alone? And one of the places which constantly figures in this debate is the rainforest of the Amazon. But all the historical evidence, and there's fantastic evidence for it, indicates that the Amazon is not pristine. It has contained human civilizations for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands. It has people living within it. It is a vast area of millions of square kilometers. To think that you can move these people out and set it aside, frankly, doesn't make any sense. Why then is the question of preservation of Amazon posed as one of pristine versus development? Is it pristine versus development, or is it different ideas of development? And if you look at ideas of development, you'll find it rooted in Brazilian history. Brazil had a notion of manifest destiny, expansion to the Atlantic, very similar to the US notion of manifest destiny, expansion to the Pacific Side. So I think, when you look at histories of nation states, the domination of nature, of landscapes, of the environment was very central to them. It is not a coincidence that there is a very famous painting, which I urge you all to go to the web and see, called the Stalin Plan for the Conquest of Nature. There's Stalin, who looks much taller in paintings than he was. He was only 5'2". In the paintings, they made him to be much taller. And he's presiding over this program to make these canals with lots of trees in the steppe. Now, this was bound to fail. Anyone who knows steppe ecology would have told you it's bound to fail, but I don't think they have the guts to tell it. And just in case you think it's only Stalin, his successor, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, who brought de-Stalinization, embarked on a very famous program called the Virgin Lands Campaign. Many parts of Russia and the Ukraine, Donbass, right now under conflict, they went in and they plowed up huge areas. And for the first 3 years, the crops were very good, and then they all failed. These were areas which were not cultivated. Had they studied the history of the peasantry, they would have understood that peasants don't cultivate these areas because they lose their fertility. The water precipitation rates are uneven. And this is what can only be called a planned foredoomed ecological disaster. This was going to happen next door, around the same time. Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward. In fact, we were discussing the bird life in your campus, and you may or may not know that Chairman Mao in '58, same year by the way, declared the war against the sparrow. And sparrows were killed across China. And Kim Il-sung, grandfather of the present ruler, wrote a very cheeky letter saying that I believe there are no sparrows in the Chinese countryside, and if you would like, I'd like to send some sparrows across. Korean comrades want to stand by their Chinese comrades. There's no acknowledgement from Mao of the letter. But I am giving these instances just to give a sense of the power of states of domination. That this is an ideological motive. People believed in this at the time. See, today when we look back, it doesn't look very rational. But please remember, when the future looks back at us, we may not look very rational. Professor Das referred to the notion of the Anthropocene. Now, one of the problems with the notion of the Anthropocene is, of course, when did it begin? When did humans start to bring about irreversible changes on Earth's surface and become a force equal to geology? This is Paul Crutzen's stuff. Well, for Crutzen it was easy. He went and measured the gases in the atmosphere and he found out the greenhouse gases, how much they are. He was a Nobel Prize winning chemist and he put that down. Now you could put that date down as 1945, you could put that date down as 1780. Post 1945 there's a huge surge of oil, gas, coal use and economic growth. 1780 is the traditional date of the Industrial Revolution. But whichever date you put, doesn't matter which date you put, that's very important. This change was not uniformly brought by all humans everywhere. Humans are not a uniform society. We live in different states. There are huge inequalities between the states. There are huge inequalities within nation states. And this is methodologically a very important issue because how do you assess the evidence? You see, do you assess it per capita? In which case India and China will say that our emissions are very low. By the way, so will Indonesia, the three major Asian countries whose rise is very significant in the last 60 to 70 years. Or would you say that those who have gotten late should pay the price, which is what the Europeans, the Americans are saying. If there is a shift to a new technology, and I'm sure you're all hearing a lot about green technology, well, 85% of the primary energy of human societies still comes from coal, gas and oil, and a lot of it comes from biomass. So none of it is particularly the right thing to do. You ought to find other means. No question about that. But if you come to this question, there is a different issue. Who will control the technology? Whether you look at solar, or you look at wind, or other renewable technologies, these will be in the hands of a small number of companies, or a small number of countries, and let's be clear, they're not going to give anything to anyone for free. So, we are back to one of the great legacies of the 20th century. The legacy is, humanity is bound together. My distinguished colleague, who's very much a product of the Kolkata, he studied in Jadavpur University in the very famous School of International Studies. He learned French. He wrote of the Vietnam War, and he has very interestingly argued that if you look at the 20th century, the Vietnam War is a very good indicator of the unleashing of a war machine, not on a people, but on a country. Because 10-12% of Vietnam was sprayed with pesticide. And this spraying with pesticide, after effects lasted for much longer. Now, interestingly, the Americans who were involved in the spray went and won a case, Agent Orange, and there was some substantial, financial redress. Their suffering could never be redressed, them and their families and loved ones. But there was no such redress for the Vietnamese. So I think it's very significant. We must keep it, and this as much as the petrochemical economy or the coal economy is part of the fossil fuel age. Let me look at something more pleasant. I always like asking my students, what did you have for breakfast? It's not a good question to ask today's students because they hate firstly coming to the class at 8:30 a.m. in the morning. Fortunately, they come to my class. So many times they say, I have not had breakfast, which is true. They rushed and came to class. In various states of readiness, we will not discuss. But I then ask, what did you have for dinner? Whatever. And you see, whatever you had, these are organic compounds. They are based on plant materials or from other living creatures. It could be fish or meat or dairy products. The chances are that the fertility of production of this plant material was driven up by the application of nitrogenous fertilizers. And nitrogenous fertilizers, as is explained by Václav Smith, the invention of nitrogenous fertilizer, or rather the synthesis of ammonia, his book Enriching the Earth, was probably one of the single greatest breakthroughs of the 20th century. It has transformed lives of people the world over, because it helped to fix far more nitrogen than all the traditional means that were used. Legumes, humus, all the things everybody here learned in biology schools. Now the synthesis of ammonia is carried out by two German scientists, one of whom was a Jew, and the Haber-Bosch process, as it was known, 1908. They also made the mustard gas, the synthesis of mustard gas, which was used in 1916 in the battlefield, and Indian soldiers were killed in it. But let's stay with the story of the urea. You see, the nitrogenous fertilizer, which is applied in fields, doesn't all go into the plant. Some of it leaches into the groundwater. Some of it leaches into the surface water. And across the world, there are algal blooms, highly destructive algal blooms, which exhaust the biological oxygen because of the nitrogenous fertilizer leaching into the soil. Now here you have a classic case where something has brought enormous benefits. And let's be clear, everybody is a beneficiary to some extent and some level of this. At the same time, the destruction of the aquatic water bodies is a very, very serious change. Because by taking away the biological oxygen, it is making life for the other aquatic creatures impossible. You can't have fish, mollusks, crustaceans, so many creatures. Let me go back and look at something, which is that on the one hand, environmental history asserts the unity of humanity, a concern for life, a concern with the living systems and the fabric of the living systems of the earth, of which we have more and more come to that. It also acknowledges that you can't look at the earth, the sky, the water without redressing these issues, and without redressing in a manner that includes those who are not given choice, because often the people who suffer the worst are those who don't have choice. So one of the most celebrated instances of conservation historically has been the creation of the national parks. The creation of national parks in the United States. Now it may interest you to know that these national parks in the initial years were policed by the US Army. There was no National Park Service. You know what armies do when they ask to police a place? They shoot on sight at anyone. Not only that, some of the most famous parks, Simon Sharma has written very movingly about this, such as Yosemite. The Havanachi Indians who gave Yosemite the name is their name. This Yosemite name comes from them. They were moved out when the park was made. It became a recreation ground, pleasure ground for people who came to the Northwest Pacific. Same with several other national parks. Even more significant is the case studied by Jane Carruthers of Kruger National Park. Kruger Park comes about in 1926. The Afrikaners and white English speakers had fought a very bitter war in 1899 to 1901 when British Army was sent to fight the Boers, and with great difficulty they crushed the Boers. Then they made up. They came together to lay the foundations of white supremacy in a multiracial society. And Kruger Park was made in the memory of one of the great generals of the Boers. It's very interesting. The park warden for many years was Stevenson Hamilton, who from the name you can make out was English. And it's a very interesting park. It's the first park in Africa or Asia where you could drive and look at animals. So the idea that you go into Kruger, you go several centuries back in time, you relive the process of going out into the veld, which the early Boer trekkers had. But actually this is all make-believe. This is happening here and now because the people who were living inside Kruger were thrown out. The people who lived around Kruger could only come in as mechanics, cooks, road layers, and so on and so forth. It became a enclave of white privilege, very large one, 20,000 square kilometers. Now, in case people think South Africa changed fundamentally after apartheid, of course it did, no question. Today, 20-25% of the visitors are non-white, but only 20-25%. More interesting, today, whereas 5% of South Africa is national park, 10% is private game park, and that 10% is all white. 70-80% of the land is still owned by whites. So this comes to a very interesting question. I began with the debate between the democracy and planned economy, or the free market economy and the planned economy. Democracy is very good for liberty. They are still the best guardian for liberty. They are an imperfect guardian for liberty. Are they the best for equality? This is the question. Look at another very interesting change. It's a very interesting book by a scholar, Gustav Sederloff. It's about the low carbon contradiction. It's a very surprising book. He's been going to Cuba for 15 years. He started going as a youthful volunteer for socialism, and later he became a scholar of the Cuban. In 1990, Cuba faced a crisis because Soviet Union collapsed and they were not getting the oil which they got at low prices. Now, you could argue that Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union was very similar to its relation to the United States, in the sense they got manufacturing equipment and oil from Soviet Union and they exported sugar. But they felt this is vital to preserve their independence vis-a-vis the US when imposed a blockade. Now, this was not available from 1990. So you know what has happened? It's extraordinary. This is the only scholar who has studied it in detail. 30% of Cuba's agriculture is organic. It's a degrowth economy. However, and this is very important, when he gave paper in our university, of course, hooked up through this Zoom, there was absolute silence for 5 minutes. Because he said there is degrowth. Degrowth is today given as one of the answers to rapid transformation of Anthropocene. We have degrowth, we will reduce our carbon footprint. He said, do you know what it really means? It means power cut for hours. Power cuts for days. It means hospitals not working, lifts not working, machinery not working, students unable to study at night. So it sounds very good, but it's been incredibly difficult. Now, through their high level of motivation, the Cubans are carrying on. But it is unlikely in another society you can replicate this. So I think this is something very significant. How far is a particular way of approaching an environmental issue replicable? This is separate from the question of whether it's desirable. May or may not consider the Cuban instance desirable. But is it replicable? And I think the sociologist and historian will both argue these are not easily replicable. Even within democracies, just to come back, there's a world of difference between the experience of the welfare state in Germany, France, and so on, and the United States. You can actually see on the environmental question, the regulatory mechanisms of the European Union, both incentive and disincentive, are much stronger than the United States. They always have been. It goes back long before the creation of the European Union. You could go to the principalities of Germany and the ideas of forestry. You could look at French kings. You could look at the city of Venice, which protected forests in order to get timber. There are various reasons. It's very, very different. And I want to end by just saying that one of the countries really fascinating to study, therefore, is India. So one of the things I tried to do in a small paper, larger paper, of course, was to look at the case of the lions of Gir Forest and pose a question. Do they have a sense of history? I was asked one of those conferences where you had to pose this question, and I'll cheat, I'll tell you the answer. No. But they do have a sense of memory. You see, since 1960, these lions have not been hunted. Their behavior with people has changed. It's changed. They are more trusting of people. They come out in the open. They're still nocturnal. That's why they look lazy and sleepy in the day, because they sleep in the day. It's like most of us look sleepy at night. But the case of the lions is particularly interesting because a change in behavior also took place when protection became universal. Their numbers start going up from 70s. And today, There are 900 plus lions, less than 200 in the 60s. They are there in 30,000 square kilometers. They are there on the outskirts of Ahmedabad. If you go to YouTube, you will see a lion in a car park. You wonder why he doesn't open a car and jump into it. And it's quite extraordinary to see the kind of relationship that has emerged well outside the Gir forest. You see the Gir forest when the Maldaris, they know how to deal with lions. They have buffaloes, the buffaloes go out in a herd. No lion has the guts to attack a herd. They may pick off a young female or a calf when they're on the way home. They put in a stockade at home. The Mandar is a vegetarian, so they don't kill the lions. I mean, they don't hunt the lion's prey. We give you a very different instance. It's a fascinating scholar called Bathsheba Demuth, who wrote a book called Floating the Coast, who has compared these two systems. It's a history of the Bering Strait from multi-species history. She's looked at Alaska and the part of Russia. And she finds something absolutely fascinating. I didn't know this. The longest lived mammal is a creature called the Atlantic bowhead whale. It lives 250 years. That means, for students of history in the room and others, if there was a bowhead whale born during French Revolution or in the early years of British rule, East India Company rule in Bengal, it could be living 250 years later. It's that long lived. Now, what she shows, using very carefully the historical record, is that these whales have been hunted for centuries. But when the steamer boat started coming, in a few years, they learned that the steamer boat coming, and they dived. They also gave a signal to other whales to dive. So the steamer boat would roam around and not be able to find the whales. This is very important. See, we think of learning as a human quality. But a lot of evidence is coming up that learning is not purely a human quality. Learning across generations can exist in many other societies. And I will say that a little bit of work I did on the lion, there is very interesting work on chimpanzee cultures. They're very different in, say, the Gombe Stream Reserve studied by Jane Goddard and the Thai forest chimp studied by the Japanese. This should not surprise us. See, there are so many people in this room. I hate to say it, suppose you throw a glass of water at one person or each person, they will behave differently. Why do we assume they all behave similarly, identically? We won't. Just so, if you look at a society in a place and say 500 or 5,000 kilometers away, it's different. It's true with animal societies as well. And I think this is something culturally was grasped much better earlier. I don't want to romanticize earlier cultures. I'm being very careful about that. But if we are to cohabit these species with many of these species, which is going to be very difficult, because a lot of us, 7.7 billion, plus our environmental footprint is huge, and I don't know if you know that besides humans, the other large number of creatures which are on the terrestrial landmass are domestic ungulates. The total number of wild ungulates is some 2 to 3% that of domestic ungulates. That's it. They're gone. They're not there. I'm not saying they're all gone, but they're very few. So if we are to work out ways to cohabit, we will need a lot of thought about it. There's no easy answer. You can't go back to how it was 100 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. At the same time, obviously we can't carry on as we are. Because if we carry on as we are, there's something more wrong. I will leave you with that, and I have tried to provoke you by posing a question. So I don't know methodology, if I've managed to cover it, if I need to say more. Right.
Well, I have entered here as a sociologist, but now I can proudly claim that I am a historian sociologist today. Only yesterday I submitted a paper for publication. The title of the paper was Paradoxes of Development, Some Critical Reflections from India. And what Maheshji was talking about was partially reflecting on some of the issues that I have: per capita income, development by home, what does the state do, what kind of policy. So the question of method is very important. How do you study a society? How do you get to know about what is happening with the people's lives? And herein, actually, while studying environment, sort of interdisciplinarity, going beyond. In fact, I teach environmental sociology, I teach development, I did PhD on labor movement, right? So, it's sort of combining approaches, and I think Solux, and now we are a Department of Humanities and Social Sciences today, thanks to the University Authority. It's not sociology, political science are separate. So it offers a much wider paradigm, much critical paradigm, to go deep into a particular phenomenon and understand how it actually exists and how one should see. So thank you very much for widening my eyes, and I think I should have delayed this my paper for at least 1 or 2 days in order to add 1 or 2 more issues. But anyway, I will have the opportunity when it comes from proofreading. But obviously, starting with developmental issues, with issues of power, with issues of Anthropocene, with the subaltern historiography, everything, I think we need to look fresh. And I think I would open up this forum for question answer, for maybe opinion, maybe some exchanges. Please.
Yeah. Short introduction. Yeah, please. Professor Ruby Shai, Emeritus Professor, Department of Sociology. Microphone, please. Take the microphone.
Thank you, sir. You have raised a very good question related to environment and so many new kinds of issues, which is happening in the world today. But and you have mentioned about the thinkers, or historians who actually lived in the Western world, So, but I am thinking that you have never mentioned about our great historian, that is Ramachandra Majumdar, because he has a tremendous contribution to our Indian society. But I didn't get any relation or any issues related to Ramachandra Majumdar. So, would you please highlight the role of Ramachandra Majumdar in Indian context?
No, I think you are better qualified on that. I stuck to the area I know best. I stuck to modern India because I'm more familiar with modern Indian sources and histories. I think that Ramachandra Majumdar and others are particularly important because they have a civilizational view of India. And this, I think, is very critical. I think that has an impact even among those who may not agree with their historiography. This is very crucial. And this is something we should think about. How does India have long period of human existence and habitation in this land, keeping the place habitable and productive? These are not terms he might have used, but these are terms we will use. Because one of the things which worries me a lot about a lot of the environmental debate of today is it is almost entirely negative. It's only about denudation, deforestation, extermination, extinction. It's fine. To raise awareness, it's all right. But I think he and other such scholars, there are others also, they looked a lot at also how societies have remade their environments. I'm little more familiar with a lot of the work which is done on Vijayanagar. And Vijayanagar actually survives for around 400 to 500 years in what is actually a semi-arid landscape. And the way it survives is by building series of small dryland reservoirs. And they are still intact. And acculturating a lot of new crops in that area. At the same time, Vijayanagar also has a destructive impact on the system. So I think you should enlighten me more. I have not read as much, and I obviously need to reread something, which I'm.
Yeah, any other please?
One of the things with a lot of these classical works, one goes and rereads it, you find something. Each time you read it,
Yes, sir. Yeah,
Microphone language. The history I consider as a mother because I belong to international relations. Whatever you have to say, it is actually our subject is started from diplomatic history. So it is the mother. And now because of the changing global environment, there is a break of a barrier actually. You have to know the history because whenever I am writing anything, what you have mentioned on Vietnam. So whenever I'm writing, you have to know the history. if I write something on environment, I have to write the history of the H crisis in 1927 in Indonesia. So we cannot ignore history. History is a model. So that is my opinion. And I am very enriched with your speech.
It's very good.
Any other, yeah, please. Introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, this is Shubhajit Halder. Sir, you were talking about the Mother Nature reclaim itself and so on. So I was thinking about the Chernobyl, what has happened after they left that area, and now I was looking at the documentary and they were showing that there are certain dogs who are there and they are very much surviving in that radioactive areas, and the authority have to keep them within that area. So do you think this is a approach, or this is Mother's Nature new way of acquiring things or surviving in this modern destructive world, or do you think that, or something like that?
So these are wolves, they are there in the Chernobyl proper, but the area around has very, very high radioactivity. In fact, the new book by Bob Woodward writes about how for once Ukrainians warned Russian troops that you're going into a high radioactive zone around Chernobyl. And you know, the radioactivity is spread over a very large area. Chernobyl was probably the most serious nuclear disaster of the 20th century. There was another one written about by Sauren Bandyopadhyay, which was covered up. So I'm very hesitant. We won't know these impacts literally for decades and centuries. We won't know. It's too early to say. The half-life of the radioactive material itself is hundreds and thousands of years. Secondly, the impact on the human body. The human body was not built to cope with this. Let's not con ourselves. It doesn't matter which political system you're from. It's not, and it can't be, and everyone knows that. That's why with all their faults, the Soviet, Russia and US, starting in Gorbachev, Reagan, and even under successive leaders, they have reduced the nuclear warheads, but they still have lots. 95% by then.
Thank you, sir.
Please.
If we look at current trends in environmental activities, we are finding it to be getting increasingly radicalized. I have in mind organizations like Extinction Rebellion, for instance. But on the part of the state, if you look at historical precedents, the state usually would go out and smash these sort of activism if we look at historical precedents. But these days, the state seem to be ready to allow them a bit of space there. Do you think it's indication of increasing maturity, or is the state doing it simply because it's more fashionable?
One is, I'm hesitant to look at movements as unified or states as unified. Both have fissures, both have different forms. Other is the reality that the slowdown in economic growth in Europe and present mood in US, I think the environmental movement is in deep crisis. Most people are worried about jobs, incomes, investment. Honestly, across much of Asia, that's the picture for a different set of reasons. Here, growth is not so much the issue. But there's a book by Deepak Nair called Catch Up. That's the issue. That seems to be that's the leitmotif of all the political leaders. It doesn't matter which country, which political system, where they are. Now, Extinction Rebellion are a large middle-class movement. Middle-class movements have their limitations. So look at something happening across Asia. Large-scale dam building, particularly in the hill and mountain areas. This has serious safety risks. Forget other things. It has serious displacement questions. It also raises questions of forest and biodiversity loss, very specific. The point, these movements, I mean, they're very important in their own right. I don't want to belittle them. But I don't see states crushing them. I think they'll simply bypass them. This is not my subject. I stand to be corrected on this.
During pandemic, the Indian state passed plenty of, on a single day, 20 laws were passed, all environmental laws. On a single day.
Sir, I have a question. Thank you so much
yes,
for
sir.
giving up time to listen. My question is, that how do you see the paradigm shift taking place in research methodology in context of environmental history? If we are talking about the changes that is taking place, even in methodology, so how do you see this is the political shift that is taking place in research methodology, or something that we have not addressed till now?
See, one of these as a student of history is how you read sources. So I give you two instances. We just had someone who got her award, so I can discuss with you, Shamaita. She looked at, Devdatta, she looked at the Sundarbans and the changing mud flats. She looked both at the literary evidence, Mangalwada, but she also looked at the archaeological evidence. So this combination of the archaeological and literary is very difficult. I have another colleague, Kalyan Chakrabarti, who looks at Harappa. He looks at the animal remains in detail. He knows the present day animal distributions very well. This could be one way. This is not what I do. Methodologically, it's a very large question. I don't think there's one answer. And I think one reason is that history itself has become very multifaceted. See, earlier there was political history, economic history, cultural history. It's not like that anymore. Any history, while focusing on one dimension, tries to take into account that period, that era, that time zone, that society. It also seeks to raise some methodological insights, which are of larger significance. So there are two things which to me, I work largely on the last 200 years, but I think they apply to the larger, let's say the last 500 years in this part of the world. I'll stick with this part of the world. You see, you're very struck when you look at South Asia, the density of people has really grown. In first century, it was around 14 to square kilometer. Today, it's around 400 to 500 to square kilometer. In 1881, it was, 88. So it's really gone up. In 1600, I think it was half of 88. Or even less, it was 33. So, 14, 33, 88, 453. The other big difference is, the area which is under cultivated arable has really grown. Now, these are not even. So, methodologically, you're dealing with a very different landscape. It's very crucial. It's a completely different landscape. The other point is nature of what gentleman asked, the nature of state power has increased, has transformed also. Not only the ease of communication or the ease of, let us say, securing resources, even the means of transport, completely revolution. We look at the last 100 years, it's completely different. And this has huge environmental implications. So when you look at a question of methodology, you're looking at virtually everything changing. So then how do you cope with this and deal with this? So I don't have a one-line answer to this. But I think environmental history faces this dual problem. Environments mean different things to different people. And those meanings are mutually contested. They are mutually conflicted. They are contested as everything else is contested. States are contested, societies are contested. However, in this particular case, there is a specific significance. This is not only about how wealth is created, distributed, processed. It's about how that process of wealth creation impacts the material conditions of existence. So there is a materiality of the living world. The material cycle flow of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, the minerals, this part. Then there is the living biota, which is animals, plants, fish, microbes. This mix is very crucial for the continuance of human civilization. I don't want to be apocalyptic. I'm not saying civilization will die. But we are at such a juncture, we have been for certainly since 1945, where humans have the ability to obliterate civilization. But definitely we have the ability to deeply damage human civilization. Now just imagine mercury poisoning, what it can do to generations of children of the future. Just to give you an instance. your question on radioactivity. What about all the people handling radioactivity in mines where they take out radioactive materials? Or people who go into coal mines. This is something in the 20th century there's a lot of work on. There's a very fine book, Fossil Capital, just come on. Charles Schutzer, where he looks at, the Raniganj mines and the Indian story. I mean, it's a frightening story. On the one hand, this place is generating all this wealth for the imperial machine and India's national project. The people who are working on it, they're inhaling this coal dust and there are these fires breaking out. So it's lasting beyond their generation. It's costing their families, the fabric of society, but it's also costing the materiality of the environment. All those fires, that sunken land, the contamination of the water.
There's one more question, right? From the yeah, please.
I
think this is the last question.
Sure.
So my question, it's not question, but just kind of a clarity or maybe what your viewpoint, if it can come from you. I completely agree with your point that like unanimously when we think about the entire environment issue, like the relationship with us, it's very difficult to standardize one policy or one way of method to resolve it. I just want to know like how do we place it in a classroom? So how do we, for example, like I studied in university which was placed in a particular district which actually faced the endosulfan issue. So the campus, actually the land for the campus determined by the state and the central government was actually the place where the incident happened. Very neighborhood land. So it's directly connected to that endosulfan issue. So what happened is that like even the claim of the state was that it will help to create a kind of a better research environment on this. But what happened is that it actually in a way removed the entire conversation to a different kind of a education conversation in that sense. The local environmental history of that place became at least converged because the class or the institution became extremely multicultural where the local history of that place became less important, right? So it was a very, so I was just thinking in terms of like when we think about a kind of education system at this point of time where we are actually going through a very strong change in terms of the policy, also going towards a kind of very standardized way of looking at many things. So how do we actually place this extremely diverse environmental, social, history kind of a context in the classroom?
I think, ma'am, you have articulated better than I could. We need to keep this rich diversity in place. Standardization is the worst thing that can happen to education. And education, if it is standardized, it will just produce, I don't know if you recall, there was a time people read up an essay on railways and they just reproduced it in the exam and everybody wrote exactly the same essay. And nobody knows how the scores were determined. And this will damage the capability of the students in long run. But I think there's a second reason. This issue, environment, is probably the issue, one of the issues of the 21st century. There is going to be no student who will not encounter this in some form in their lives, in their workplace, in their study, in their future. And if we equip them better, there is no place better to begin than the immediate environment. It will be a little sensitive and careful how we do it. But it could be the environment of the school, it could be the district, it could be anything. That is, I think you have articulated it far better than I do. And I do think there is something in what you say that very few of us have integrated the complete decline of our own cities, where we are mostly located, or towns, into the way we teach. It's there, but it's somewhere in the background. But thank you. It's a very, very important question. Thank you so much.
Excuse me, sir.
No, sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm just barging in.
No, sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know where the voice was.
I'm seriously sorry for this, sir, but it's a very small question, very small. I'm Anuna Bose from the Department of Political Science. I just want to ask you that
in a country like India, do you think that development of climate or any kind of development towards environment and parallelly the politics of India, both are mutually exclusive? I mean the status of politics. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm being very personal.
Not a question. It requires a separate lecture. We'll discuss over it.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry for this question actually.
Yeah, so everyone, now it's a time for high tea. Tea are available here. So for 5 minutes there is a tea. Okay. After that there is a online session, guest lecture on history, memory and literature by Sarvani Datta Gupta ma'am is there online. So return back as soon as possible within 5 minutes. Teas are there.
Initially it was very জায়গাটা ব্লক হয়ে গেছে পেছনের রোডটা হ্যাঁ ওদিক থেকে হ্যাঁ টিভিতে জুম করে তাই তো ঠিক আছে তাই এখন দেখি অনলাইনে হবে কোথায় গেলে তুই কেন তখন তো আমি নিয়ে এলাম তারপর স্টুডিও কি করে দেখো যেখানে ঝোল তেল বেশি করলে ভালো
গ্রুপ ফটোটা তোলাতে কি জানি করে চলে গেল আমার কি আছে পরে আর হবে না
চা খেয়ে আমার আসবে মনে হয়
আসুক চলে যাক আমার তো বন্ধ করে দে নাকি
হবে আবার হবে
হবে কিন্তু এখন
লাইভে রয়েছে তো
লাইভটা বন্ধ করতে হবে তাই এরকম ভাবে লাইভে যায় না
না লাইভ আবার কি আবার করবো আবার
তাহলে ওইটা লাইটটা ধরছি আমি লাইটটা অন্যকে একটা কিছু তাহলে দিই
ওইটাতে ধরে দিচ্ছি
একদম জুম করে শুধু উপরে লেখাটা দিতে
হ্যাঁ তাই করছি
আর জুম কর রাখ না ওখানে। বলো বই ভালো ছবি নিচ্ছে। হ্যাঁ নীল দেখলাম দুটো দাগ।
আমি দেখি
ওটা দে, তোকে দেখার জন্য তো দিইনি। দে ছেলেকে দে, এটা দে।
আমরাই আগে পৌঁছলাম 8:30। তারপরে
আমি
আমাদের 74টা না
আমার ফোন নাম্বার কালকে দিয়ে দিল ছেলেকে তুই ছবিটা দেখ তাকিয়ে আছে কাল আমার দিকেই তাকিয়ে আছে দেখেছিস? হ্যাঁ এই ছোটটার এত বড় চশমা হয়ে গেল। বড় কিছু দেখতো নাকি? হ্যাঁ
ছোট ছিল তখন
তার পাশে চলেছিলি দেখে ফেলেছে মনে হয়।
সমাজ
সামনের দিকে তাক। পাঠা ওরা কিছু ছোট্ট পাঠিয়েছে, মা ছেলে দুটো পাঠা
আপনি কাইন্ডলি ওটা একটু আমাকে পাঠিয়ে দেবেন।
ওটা পাঠিয়েছিস?
হ্যাঁ ওটা আমি
তো সিঙ্গেলটা পাঠিয়েছিস তো?
বলছি ওই আরে যতগুলো পাঠিয়েছি
সিঙ্গেলটা পাঠা।
আচ্ছা আমি রান্না করার জন্য ওই আপনাকে বলে দেবো। হ্যাঁ আমি রান্নাইটার কথা বলেছি তো না ওই যে যেগুলো রান্না হয়। হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে। তুমি বাড়ি এখন দেখা যাচ্ছে ওই বাবার নামেই নেই। পাশের মানে কাঠের কাঠটা আর ঠাকুমার জমি ছিল। এইটা $2 টাকা চেয়েছিল বার করার জন্য পাসপোর্ট এই একটু টেনশন ঠিক আছে। আর ওই ওখানে যেমন আমি ভুলভাল দিদি না ওর কথা শুনছিলাম ওরা টাকা পয়সা দিল $3 লাখ টাকা দিদি বলতে পারে না দিদার বলতে দাও আমি ওই $2 টাকা দিয়েছি
বিনার থেকে জিজ্ঞেস করছি বুঝলি?
আমি এনে নেবো
থেকে ছাড়া জানতে পারবি না কি করে কি করতে হবে। ওই সবই তোর নিচে, তো বাবার সবই আছে।
বাবার না
জমিটা
ওই কথা আমার বাড়ি কোথাও ছিল আমাকে ঠিক আছে আমার বাবার সব খুব ভালো ইয়ে করে দিয়ে তুমি চা খেলে? হ্যালো হ্যালো বলো আমি তো রিসিভ করতে পারি আমি দেখি পরে আমার সামনে হ্যাঁ আমি তারা
স্যার এটা রেকর্ডিংটা কোথায় পাচ্ছে? এটা রেকর্ডিং হচ্ছে? এখনো হচ্ছে তো, মানে পাওয়া যাবে তো? হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, ম্যাম শুনতে চাইছে যেটা মিস হয়েছে।
লাইভে ওটাতেও পাবি, অ্যাডামাসের ফেসবুক পেজেই পাবি। অ্যাডামাস লাইভ আছে।
লাইভে যেতে লাইভের থেকে ডাউনলোড করে
মানে যা উল্টোপাল্টা কোয়েশ্চেন করছি সব শোনা যাবে তো, যা উল্টোপাল্টা কথা বলছি।
হ্যাঁ লাইভটা থাকে।
তাহলে চেক করো।
এখানে না আমাকে বাইরে দিতে পাঠাবো দিদি এসে
কল করে দিয়েছে তুই বলবি
আরে অঙ্কর টিচার কি যেতে বলেছে এখন? না লাঞ্চ করবো আড়াইটে বলেছে দুটো হবে না তিনটে হবে ইন্ডিয়ান ফ্যামিলি আপনাদের কিন্তু বলেছে দুটো আড়াইটে ধরে গেছে আমি সোয়া দুটো ধরে নিলাম কাজটা তুমি অন্তত সরকারি ম্যাম থাকে এইটা এসকেটাকে নিয়ে যাও না এটা থাকুক এখানে ফুলধারের থেকে
হ্যালো ম্যাডাম শুনতে পাচ্ছেন? হ্যালো হ্যালো শুনতে পাচ্ছেন ম্যাডাম? হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ ম্যাডাম আমরা শুনতে পাচ্ছি, থ্যাংক ইউ। Hello, hello, yes madam, you are audible.
ওটা শান্তি মিশ্র আধা ঘন্টা দিয়ে বাচ্চা নিয়ে তুমি না ঠিক বলেছিলে এক্সটার্নাল দিয়ে মডারেট করতে হবে। হ্যাঁ ও বলেছিল তখন বার্তা দিয়ে।
So we will now start our online lecture. I hope everybody is here. Shavani ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So the first online lecture that we are going to have now is will be delivered by Dr. Shavani Guptu, who is presently a fellow of Netaji Institute for Asian Studies, Kolkata. She was formerly professor in Asian Literary and Cultural Studies. Her main area of research are nationalism and culture in the colonial and post-colonial period. Her publications include 3 monographs: The Actress in the Public Theatres of Calcutta, that is published from Primus; The Music of Nationhood, Rajendralal Roy of Bengal, again from Primus 2018, which received the Harilal Gupta Memorial Award for Best Historical Work by a Women Historian at the Indian History Congress Kannur Session 2018. And the third monograph is Knowing Asia, Being Asian, Cosmopolitanism and Nationalism in Bengali Periodicals, 1870 to 1940. Recently, her edited and translated volumes, Wandering Women, Travel Writings in Bengali Periodicals, 1900 to 1940, has been published from Primus Books, Delhi. Her co-edited books are Performance and the Culture of Nationalism, Central and Southeast Asia, with Mimansha Pandit, The Regional Great Game in the Indian Ocean and India's Evolving Maritime Strategy, with Vivek Mishra, and On Modern Indian Sensibilities, Culture, Politics, History, with Ishita Banerjee Dubey. She was guest editor of Gender Asia, special issue of Asian Studies in 2018. She has presented papers in national and international conferences, as well as contributed numerous papers in edited volumes and journals of repute. I now welcome ma'am and request you to start your lecture. Okay, I'm really sorry ma'am for interrupting. To chair the session, we have with us Professor Shantanu Chakravarti, who already Honourable Vice-Chancellor sir has said that he is currently the Professor of History in the University of Calcutta and is also associated with our Department of History at Adamas University as an adjunct professor. Sir, I request you to come to the stage, or if you are comfortable there. So I request Professor Mahesh Rangarajan sir to kindly come up on the stage and felicitate Professor Shantanu Chakravarti sir. So I now request ma'am to kindly start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very good introduction. I've been asked to speak about history, memory and literature, which is a huge, very vast subject. So I'm going to make it slightly linear by bringing in my research, introduce my research into this. First of all, I must thank Surandana for I have been suffering from flu for the past few days, so I couldn't make it to the conference, but thanks to Suranjana for organizing this online, making it possible for me to present this paper. So history, memory, literature are intricately intertwined, with literature serving as a powerful tool for exploring and shaping both personal and collective historical memories. Literature can create narratives that reveal, challenge, and even rewrite historical events, impacting how individuals and societies understand their past. The relationship between history, memory, and literature is complex and multifaceted, with each influencing and informing the other. Literature can serve as a powerful tool for understanding and interpreting history, while memory, both collective and individual, shapes how we experience and remember the past. Historians and literary scholars today are increasingly exploring this relationship between history and memory, recognizing the importance of understanding how our memories shape our understanding of the past. Now, this framework is basically about history, memory, and literature, but what I'm going to do about that, this actually reminds me of the little girl in Sound of Music, who after she learns the do re mi fa sol la ti do, she said, but it doesn't mean anything. But it will mean something when you contextualize it. So I'm going to use 3 junctures in history in order to contextualize this interconnectedness. The first juncture is the late 19th and early 20th century, and this is that genre of literature which is fiction, wherein poetry and drama, Vijayanlal Roy used this interconnectedness of memory and history to rewrite history in literature. The second juncture is in the first decades of the 20th century, when in the literary periodicals, which had started from mid 19th century but really came into its own in the 20th century, they created, through the children's periodicals, created notions of the ideal child. And the third juncture that I'm going to talk about today is in the 1950s, when during the India-China relations that were being fostered both by Jawaharlal Nehru and Mao of China, where history, memory intermingle with the present-day reality. This I have looked at, it's a project, ongoing project that I'm doing now, and looking at all the memoirs, diaries, archival material on the Bengali travelers going into China in that period. So for the first juncture, from the 19th century, the study of history acquired unprecedented importance and reach. It was used both by the colonizers as well as the colonized to buttress their self-confidence, to explain their present as well as locate themselves vis-a-vis the other in the world scheme of things. Just as for the British, history became the principal instrument to justify colonization, for the Indian intelligentsia, a search for sustenance in past glories, real or imagined, as well as efforts to use history to probe the present day misfortune, acquired a centrality. It was a way of talking about the collective self and bringing it into existence. History Itihash acquired a new and vast pedagogical and intellectual reach. It encompassed within colonial constraints the writing of an indigenous history marked by a quest for facts, but also legends, genealogical narratives, and myths which the Western notion of history had rejected. Besides the subject matter of history, its vastly extended reach, transitioning from manuscript to print, took its place in the structure of formal education. History, in its extended reach, became an important ingredient of literature. In Vijayanlal Roy's works, there is a use of factual and imaginary history. In his dramas, he has chosen episodes from history, but has woven an imagined tapestry with an emphasis on the values and qualities he wishes to highlight. In his verses and poems, there is a selective choice of memories, both historical and mythological, in which there is an emphasis on its ability to illustrate the central idea of the writer, rather than its actual position in time, place, or context. The patriotism that Vijayanlal invoked was of a complex nature. The notion of the country Desh had to be made popular through a reconstruction of its past history. In the search for national history, Vijendralal along with others searched for moments of valor, sacrifice and presence of a distinct enemy. Rajasthan in James Todd's annals could fit the bill. What distinguished Vijendralal was that in this search, he insisted in creating stereotypes which exemplified those qualities he considered to be important for the citizens of the new nation. His patriotic songs cited examples of these stereotypical exemplary characters which had been present in the past and had to be invoked in the present so that an ideal nation could be regained. So the past had to be an idealized one in which the future also could be visualized. Drama provided a way to extend the reach of history. It is true that as a reading exercise, drama has a limited audience, but as performing art, its reach is far wider. In fact, Vijendralal's historical plays were popular and performed all over the countryside. For generations, the dialogues have been recited and songs sung even when the plays were no longer being performed on the public stage. Although the central ideas of the plays are taken from history, it is apparent that for Vijendralal, historical accuracy is not of utmost importance. It was the ideas that were more important. Historical incidents provided the gist for his ideas. One important deviation, in fact there has been a lot of criticism by many critics that he has not been very accurate historically, but he himself wrote in the introduction of some of his plays that his point is not to bring in the real historical facts, all the historical facts, that he stay true to historical facts, but rather to take out certain incidents in order to make a certain point and create certain important values. One deviation that Vijendralal frequently made was the creation of his female characters. In most of the plays, they were creations of his imagination, but played an important role as conveyors of his ideas. Among the plays that Vijendralal were based on history, some may be categorized as plays on the Mughal period. Within these categories, there are some which have Rajputs as the central characters and others which have Mughals as the central characters. In the Rajput plays, of course he didn't call them Rajput plays, I'm calling them. In the Rajput plays, the Rajputs are portrayed as patriots and the concentration is on the nation as a theme. In these plays, the qualities that are stressed may be referred to as national values, necessary for the preservation of the community and the nation. Valor, bravery, simplicity, loyalty, self-sacrifice, etc. The Mughals appear in these plays as the other who do not possess the true values of a patriot. In these plays, in these Rajput plays, the Rajputs are first and foremost soldiers. So they have to have all the qualities of a good soldier, and the women in these plays are also very good soldiers. His technique in the Rajput plays is clear: identification of virtues and values essential for building of the ideal nation. He discovers the reasons that had caused their erosion and reaffirms the need to overcome these barriers for the nation's reconstruction. The most efficient means of inculcating enduring values was to internalize them at the level of the family, the basic unit of the society. Vijendralal therefore uses a double move from a broader spectrum of the nation to the smallest unit of the family and then back again to the level of the state. In the Mughal plays, where the Mughal characters are central, there is the use of the modernist interpretation of history, which is interpretation of imperial power in domestic terms. But the process doesn't stop there. It is but a step in the nation-building process. The Mughal plays concentrate on the Mughal imperial family and the Rajputs appear incidentally. In these plays, the Mughals are not conquerors or empire builders, at least the qualities of power are not emphasized. The concentration is on their qualities as human beings within the family structure. The second juncture is during the early 20th century, when periodicals, literary periodicals had already come of age. They actually started from the 1860s with the introduction of education, with the spread of education. Periodicals were a means of diverse number of people with diverse motives trying to create public opinion, informed public opinion, and also through these periodicals, not make a point, but to make the point, which was to create again an idealized nation. Women and children were of course a part of this nationalist project in different ways. There is a tendency in modern history writing to bring the history of Indian children under the purview of family and gender. But one can notice in the literary magazines for children in the first half of the 20th century, various other templates through which the new child is constructed for the new nation. In one area at least, children's magazines were very similar to the adult literary magazines, though with greater creative modifications, and that was in the representation of the world, particularly Asia. So my work with the periodicals has actually been, obviously the subject matter in the periodicals is really very vast, but I have chosen articles from around 30-40 journals, chosen around 500-600 articles, which were specifically aimed at trying to understand Asia. And in the children's magazines, this is exactly what is aimed at, to understand other Asian countries and to find an Asianism. And the reason for that, it is pointed out, is that the qualities of the different Asian countries, the Asian values, will be inculcated amongst the Indian child, and that will help to create the modern Indian nation. Molding the mind of the child in the early 20th century, Bengal was associated with certain developments occurring within India, as well as a close acquaintance of the Bengali intellectuals with world affairs and important ideas and trends prevailing in the world, all of which had an important effect on the psyche of the educated Bengali. Rabindranath Tagore, in his Jivan Smriti, in his memories, he is writing about how, as a child, he used to really enjoy reading grown-up periodicals because it brought the world to him. The rise of Bengali literature and prose led to the flowering of this print media, which became an important instrument of expression of nationalist and anti-colonial ideas. At this time, the Swadeshi movement of 1905 had the important effect on the Bengalis to realize the power of the print in the spread of patriotic ideas. The idea that was being popularized was that not only a strong, morally flawless nation would be able to free the country from the alien rule, the components of the ideal nation, men, women and children, must live up to the ideal qualities and values in order to do so. The magazines reflected the varied nature of what the ideal qualities could be. So these magazines, unlike the first genre I talked about, was not fiction, but they were based on reality. They were different, they were literature, of course, but it was not fiction. What is important is that in the selection of news, incidents of the past, translations of stories from different countries, role models for children, all this was a selection of information from world knowledge in order to mold the child's mind towards a new model of childhood, which was perceived as necessary for the new nation, which would come at independence. And this, I have already written a book and as well as articles on this point, and shown how the different magazines like Shokha, like Sandesh, they use entertainment as well as knowledge. Sandesh is actually meaning both a message and a sweet. So it was. This is how the children would be influenced, would be made open to this world of knowledge, so that they would have the best childhood. The third juncture is the 1950s, post-independence, when after the communist rule was announced in China in 1949, Nehru's government and the Chinese government organized an exchange of goodwill missions, and a number of Bengalis visited China over 2 decades and wrote about their experiences in books and journals. This was a third type of literature, the personal travel account of journey to China, not only a restricted one, but interpretative. Why I say this, it's more interpretative, is that they are all writing, they are all talking about how they are being sent to understand the real China. Because, as I have already written before, that Bengalis consider themselves a very proprietorially knowing China, that the Indians understand Chinese much more than Westerners because we have links from the past. And these memories are used again and again to show that when we go to China, when Indians go to China, we will understand Chinese much more. It is true that there were many allegations that were raised that you will only be shown, you will be only given a guided tour of China. You will not be able to understand what the reality was. You will be shown the rallies and the propaganda. But what these writers are writing is that they do understand much more than they are shown, because it is true that they are using interpreters because they don't know the language and a guided tour is necessary because it's an alien country. But they from before setting off for this mission, they contact the Chinese government through the different organizations and associations that they are going through. They contact them to find local contacts from the government, beyond the government, and they are sending that archival materials which are kept in the archives and also written in their, sometimes also written in their books, that they are talking to the local people so that they can see the real China, understand the real China. And while writing this, in fact, the recent most book that has come out is that of Gomina Thapar, who, as you know, is one of our greatest historians, and she is writing about her time that when she goes to China as a student in the 50s, and she is also wanting to know whether all that she heard about China during her student days was really true or not, and whether the socialist revolution there will be successful, communist revolution will be successful or not. So she also wants, like all the Bengalis who are traveling to China at this time, wants to know the real China. And the strategy that we use is memory. The strategy that they use is the past historical connectivity. They are recalling the ancient past of interaction when the Buddhist monks traveled between India and China, as well as the recent past, which is what I was talking about in the periodicals that is mentioned throughout the 20th century. So many Bengalis and Indians have been traveling to China and writing about it. So all of this is in the psyche of the people who are writing about India-China relations in the 1950s and 60s and even 70s, and even as late as 2012. And they are also talking about the upheavals, not just what they are seeing, but also discussing the histories, the past history of colonization under the British rule in India, and the upheavals, the civil war and the upheavals in China are being compared and analyzed. So in this way, history, historical memories of collective memories, individual memories are all discussed through literature, different genres of literature, in order to construct and reconstruct history in the different ages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for the enlightening lecture. I now request Professor Shantanu Chakravarti to come to the dais and say a few things.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, let me thank the organizers, Dr. Netaji Kumar and others of the History Department for extending a kind invitation to me. It's always a pleasure to visit Adamas University here. Listening to three eminent speakers since morning brings to my mind in the famous writing of Robert Cox, who once reminded us that theories are always meant for someone and for some purpose. And I was wondering whether it's applicable, whether the same is applicable for methods and methodology in historical studies. Also, listening to Professor Das, listening to Professor Das in his capacity as an eminent historian, and Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, of course, has reminded us of the immense possibilities and challenges in which our focus on social sciences, in this case history in particular, seems to be developing. Professor Sauren Bandyopadhyay has focused on one major aspect of this theme. She has focused primarily on the intercontextuality between different sources of literature. She has focused primarily on two types, as far as I could understood: children's fiction and travelogues, and to what extent these could be integrated within our within our own purpose of historical analysis. Now, without saying too much things, because how much time do I have? Do I have to speak? Five minutes? Okay. Probably I could focus on two of these aspects. First of all, as she has already very elaborately pointed out, the way in which the literature here, particularly children's fiction and travelogues, were reflecting contemporary realities of these times. I was thinking, if you look at children's fiction produced in Bengal, she has focused primarily on early 20th century literature. But even if we extend our story a little earlier to late 19th century, you come across two prototypes. One is, of course, that of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar's Gopal Rakhal prototypes, one of a traditional good boy in a traditional sense, and Rakhal, who tends to put into question social authority in different ways, the so-called quote-unquote naughty boy who does not accept established norms. And of course, if we come down then to early 20th century, you have another example, that of Sukumar Rai's Pagla Dashu, who once again challenges established norms in his own ways. Now, and I would say that if you look at the colonial impact on the middle class fiction produced in early 20th century, I think it was developing somewhere in between these two major broad strands. Professor Gupta has elaborated on most of these areas. One area I think which also requires our attention in this span is that of crime fiction. Crime fiction, particularly for children and young adults, which were becoming regular in established magazines and journals and periodicals which were coming out. To an extent, it was a reflection of social reality. Just to give you one example, the noted writer who wrote, who was one of the leading names, Bengali names in crime fiction in early 20th century, Hemendra Kumar Roy, himself wrote, one book reflecting on Calcutta underworld titled Rater Kolkata. It was not written in his own name, but later on, it has been republished, and that was quite a reflection. And if you look at if you compare that writing with some of his, crime fiction stories, you would see how close to actual reality his writings were. Coming to the other aspect, Professor Sauren Bandyopadhyay has focused primarily on Indians traveling to China and writing on China. Now, you had several categories of Indians traveling to China since late 19th century and during early 20th century. You of course had the famous text of Thakur Gadadhar Singh, who went in as a part of the company's army during to quell Boxer rebellion, and he leaves behind his own account. You had accounts of the Bengali traveler Indu Madhav Mollik, who travels to China in late 19th century, compares and contrasts between Indians and Chinese, praises the Chinese as workers, entrepreneurs, etc. Travelogues, I would argue, also must be incorporated in in a major manner, because we have, because till now, if you look at the way traditional history is taught and disseminated in our educational institutions, there seems to be a bit of skepticism against what is what is termed as popular literature, and travelogues often are categorized within that. However, there are, you also you can get important snippets of life. And here I would just mention two, which not many people are aware of. Hirendra Kumar Bosu, the famous Bengali director during 1930s and 40s, he continued to produce some movies right down to 1950s after independence. During 1940s, late 1939-40, he was approached by a Congress politician who was asked that if you look at Africa, Indians seem to be learning most about Africa from the Tarzan movies. And here, the general idea seems to be the West has civilized Africa. But what about the old Indian connections? We need a movie on that. And that Congress politician arranged funding for this film director to go and shoot for his movie in Africa. And Africa Mein Hind was the first Indian movie which was shot in Africa, and which became quite popular when it was released here. Hirendra Kumar Bosu is, within literary circles, he was also a person who used to write for children in popular magazines like Shuktara. Some of his early, his diaries, his anecdotes of his days during African, during his film shooting in Africa, were later on combined and produced by as a book titled Bone Jongole. I have heard it's out of print now, but some people can download copies of it from the internet. Now, it's an important glimpse as to how middle-class gentleman from one particular colonial setting was experiencing Africa. He mentioned in his various encounters there, he compares and contrasts the experience of Indians as a colonized country with that of Africa. It's not that he always cannot avoid the typical stereotypings about Africa, of which he had learned from the Westerners, but there are ways and means in which he tries, as Professor Gupta says, tries to make his own interpretations. And that, these examples are important, and these are something which must be incorporated within our study of history if we want to make it more diverse and more interesting. I think I will end. Is there any time for questions? Then some questions. Yes, please.
Chancellor, can I ask a question? Chancellor.
Yeah, sir. Oh, yes, sir. Please.
Can I ask a question?
Please, sir.
Could I first congratulate Sean on the wonderful presentation? But could I ask a provocative question to Sean? Nowadays we are all hearing about whereby the existing political regime by manipulating memory to legitimize their rule. In such circumstances, how would a historian confront this particular issue in order to go in for exercising, monitoring exercise of this journalism?
Well, I have a very easy answer. I am not going to comment on how you will address this issue. I can only comment on how I would address this issue, and this is exactly what I have been doing. My book on Asia that was published some time back, that book actually talks about cosmopolitanism more than nationalism, mixed with nationalism. I highlight cosmopolitanism more than nationalism just for this reason, so that memories, it is basically how you select memories. When it's your selection that matters, and I have selected that part, so I will give you one example. In the 1920s, there was a movement going on in Kolkata, which is called the Greater India Society. And this movement, which was actually very, very historically good, in the sense that it was exploring the spread of cultures between the Asian countries, and then it acquired, because of nationalism, it acquired a much more aggressive kind of nationalism, calling it Indianization, which was disliked by the Southeast Asian countries because it kind of minimized their, what should I say, their productivity, or their, after all, they had adapted. There was no Buddhism that went into different parts of Southeast Asia, which remained exactly the same Buddhism that was in India. So it was local initiative which changed it, and this local initiative was being denied by this thing. So when I wrote my book, I made it a point to point out in one whole chapter that these articles which were actually, so this movement or this historical initiative of Greater India Society, which became very aggressive, was actually only isolated with the scholarship, with the scholarly articles. But when it was written, rewritten or translated into the Bengali journals, it did not have this kind of aggression. Then it became much more receptive to what was being, because it was written by people who were traveling, people who were looking at local cultures, who were going and praying at the Buddhist monasteries in different parts of Burma and other parts of Southeast Asia. So that changed perspectives a lot. So my point of view is that I am bringing out, so every historian has to use their own intelligence to bring out their certain aspects, certain other memories which can counteract the memories that are being manipulated by the powers that be.
They mean corroborative memories.
Okay. Corroborating. No, not corroborating what. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that bring out other memories which are already there, but they are not chosen by the powers that for their own political gain. So let's try to bring out other memories.
Okay. Thank you.
If I could just extend the question asked by Professor Das, Professor Gupta, memories could be institutionalized, let's say in the form of museums. And as you have elaborated, the historians and travelers, a lot of historians traveled under the Greater India Society scheme, and a lot of collections which you see in Calcutta Museum and our own Calcutta University Museum, of course, are related to that travel. Now, that is a way in which you try to institutionalize memory, and when you try to recreate your memory through travelogues or in other forms of writings, is it much more challenging? What would be your opinion regarding it?
No, it's much less challenging because it's more fluid. Because you can interpret a writing in your own way, with your own subjectivity. But you can't do that once it has been already institutionalized in a museum. It's much more difficult to do. Then the whole setting has to be changed if you want to bring about the change. But when you are using written testimony, it's much easier to interpret it. Second person, tomorrow some students will refute me and bring in their own interpretation. So it's much easier with written testimony.
There was another question.
I have one question, Professor.
Ma'am used mic.
Everything in a very nice way.
Ma'am.
Sauren, if I can once again extend Chancellor's point, you see, in the matter of keeping collective memory, very often public monuments and memorials play a greater role than text. So, as behind public monuments and memorials, memory plays an important role. And how you present the memory. For example, take the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. A monument that was any memorial is immediately after that by the British to be completely different from the memorial that we placed in both independent India, and even in both independent India it could be placed a different way. So the point that Chancellor was mentioning is of very crucial importance, particularly for historians like you, who are using memory as a very important source for reconstructing history of a particular period.
No, that is what I'm trying to say. It's much more difficult when it's institutionalized already. It's much easier for those who are using written text. I agree. But it does not mean that we give up the act. Even if that is much more influential, there has to be other means. I mean, there has to be also books written.
Sure.
So that, yeah.
We changed the showing data. But you know, there's a whole range of memories which are associated auxiliary monuments, which perhaps was erased out when we converted into showing data. I think that was the point that Chancellor was making, and I was interested how, as a historian using memory, would confront such situations.
Yeah, it's great responsibility for those who are doing the museum building, or any monument. Monument visit. So, according to my travelers, they go visiting even in the 1920s and 30s. They are all visiting the monuments that are built after the war. You know, so the interest of people in visiting monuments will always be there. So it is our greater responsibility to do it in the correct way. But what the correct way is, nobody can actually predict, because every government.
That is a very important paper that you read. And Shubhotu is here also present. See, both myself and Shubhotu had worked on the Calcutta Underground, the Buddhas of Calcutta. Take any figure, say, we all know about Gopal Pata. Now, Gopal Pata, in public memory, has a completely different sort of story than the memory that has been put in the colonial records. So both are memories. How do you approach the two categories?
Sure, as an historian, you analyze the two and point out. So the importance of writing can never be denied. I mean, you have to write it down and you have to bring it out and discuss.
That is a point of intersection. Very often, unwritten memory play a greater role than the written memory. And in that conjuncture, how does a historian confront the situation? That was anyway, we can discuss later. Very good. Thank you, Robert.
Yes. Professor Sauren Gupta, thank you very much for your nice presentation on this new area. So it is very nice, but I am wondering why you have selected only China, because in Asia, you know, 48 countries are there. And Japan is also very important because that is also a Buddhist country. And many people have traveled from India to Japan and other places. But you only concentrated on China's memory and China's history and China's literature only. So I am wondering in that sense. So I want to know from you that under which circumstances you only mentioned about China only. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a whole book which deals with India's relations with the different Asian countries, and Japan written about, in fact, not China. But why I chose China for today's, only for today's paper, is for the reason that I was talking about three junctures. One was from fiction, that was Vijendralal Rai. This was when nationalism was still in a state of flux, where the imagined nation was there was no real idea of the nation. Then in the 1920s, when a nebulous idea of the nation is more or less being formulated, where patriotism is being stronger. And then the third juncture, I chose the post-independence period on a topic which I am working on now. It has to be on the three areas in which I have worked. But I have actually in my book written about in Bengali intellectuals foray into all the countries of Asia. Definitely Japan has the largest number of articles written on. In fact, I will tell you one secret, no women traveler to China has ever written a book before 1950. That's really very sad, but on Japan, a number of women writers have written, books. So I don't know the reason for it. I still have not been able to figure out the reason, but it's not that I have ignored the other countries of Asia. It's there in my book. But just for today's lecture, I chose these three junctures, just because I only had 20 minutes.
Yeah, please. One last question is that you say that crime fiction, early 20th century, crime fiction is a very important role. What is the historical background? Because there is a Bonkesh Bokshi written, Sauren Bandyopadhyay, and
I think Chair is allowed to, give replies to any, okay.
Historical role. What is the historical role the early 20th century in Bengali crime fictions? That is in present Sauren Bandyopadhyay and Bonkesh Bokshi, especially in detective stories. So, what is the historical role?
Just to give you answer in points, number one, it reflects the actual dark realities of a changing society. Modernization has a dark underbelly in every society, and Calcutta here was also not an exception. You have such records from late 19th century, and from early 20th century you have published works reflecting it. I talked about Hemendra Kumar Roy's Rater Kolkata. You have, from 1930 onwards, Calcutta Police starts bringing out a regular magazine which gives you detailed description of important or notable crimes committed in Calcutta. And if you look at contemporary fiction of Hemendra Kumar Roy and others, and remember you had important series, crime fiction series being published by publishing houses like Devshaitya Kutir, for instance, some of which are getting reprinted again. And many of these were actually, the actual themes, the stories actually were picked up from Calcutta, Police Journal and others. So in a way, it reflects the changing social reality. It also, in a way, reflects, how, because crimes were also associated with changing societal norms, changing economic dimensions, how the underground economy was financing or were getting financed. You also had, increasing focus of involvement of both insiders and outsiders. To, in a way, contemporary crime should be regarded as an important sub-theme of socio-cultural history. Are there any more questions for Professor Gupta? Okay, one last question perhaps, please.
Thank you, Professor Gupta, for such a wonderful talk. So I was wondering that since you talk about the intersection of history and literature, what about the contemporary, very 21st century popular historical fictions where we continuously see this blurring of lines between history, myth, and a certain kind of discursive rhetorical spirituality. And they are being read a lot and they form the kind of an inextricable element of the bestseller market, literary market right now.
I will leave that interpretation to you because I have absolutely no idea about this subject, and I only talked about these three chapters because these are the researches that I have been doing my whole life. So, for about the latest fiction, I will leave to you. Thanks.
So if there are no more questions, I will end the session. But before we end, could we have a big hand for the speaker?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
না এটাও সিনথেটিক ইয়ে থাকলে সিন করবে sometimes
Now we will take a break for the lunch, and I request all of you to come back at 2:30. We'll start our next session. Thank you very much.